Dobry večer. Good evening to all those joining us from various locales for the 2022 Mohyla Lecture, the first in a virtual format. My name is Nadia Foti-Onishchuk, and I am the Interim Director of the Prairie Center for the Study of Ukrainian Heritage and tonight's host. Before I continue, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the PCUH and St. Thomas More College are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. As we near our 25th year, the Prairie Center for the Study of Ukrainian Heritage is ever committed to our mission of promoting the advanced study of many aspects of Ukrainian heritage, culture, and life. Our programs and projects continue to preserve and promote awareness and appreciation of the Ukrainian experience in Canada and beyond. As an anchor of the pioneering tradition of Ukrainian studies at the University of Saskatchewan, we proudly encourage and guide the work of undergraduate and graduate students interested in this area. Perhaps most importantly, we honor the community-university partnership, which is at the heart of our work, and respect our position as an important link between the University of Saskatchewan, St. Thomas More College, and the Ukrainian community. A few technical housekeeping items to review. We kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras turned off for the duration of the lecture. There will be an opportunity for Dr. Ivakhiv to answer your questions. So in the spirit of simplifying this medium, we ask that you please type them into the chat box that you will find at the bottom of your screen, and I will read each question out to Dr. Ivakhiv following his presentation. Thank you for your cooperation. Also a note that this lecture is being recorded, and we will be sharing it through our social media for others to enjoy. I would now like to introduce our Dean, Dr. Tammy Marsh, to bring greetings on behalf of St. Thomas More College.
Thank you, Nadia. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to PCUH's 24th Annual Mohyla Lecture and to pass on greetings from the Dean's Office and St. Thomas More College. I'm certainly looking forward to when we are able to host this lecture again in person at the college, but given that we weren't able to do so last year, it's wonderful that we can offer it remotely, and it's wonderful to see so many people here. S-Team is very pleased to be involved in supporting Ukrainian studies in the Prairie Center for Ukrainian Heritage. We are very happy to support the development of a new certificate in Ukrainian studies this year, which students will be able to register for starting in May. And we continue to provide support for the spring session in Ukraine Education Abroad program. The college received $165,000 this year to support this program from the federal government's Global Skills Opportunity Initiative, which is administered by Universities Canada. PCUH's mission to promote the advanced study of various aspects of Ukrainian heritage, culture, and life, and to promote a wider understanding and appreciation of the Ukrainian experience in Canada and abroad is all the more important now with the current Russian threat to invade Ukraine. The center is also seen as an important link between the University of Saskatchewan, St. Thomas More College, and the Ukrainian Canadian community. STM values its relationship with the Ukrainian community, and we look forward to celebrating PCUH's 25th anniversary next year. The Mohyla Lecture, which was launched in 1994, is a major academic event in Ukrainian studies at STM and the university. The series is devoted to inviting scholars from around the world to discuss the topics of Ukrainian heritage and contemporary Ukraine, as well as Ukrainian Canadian affairs. On behalf of the college, I would like to thank Dr. Ivakhiv for serving as this year's Mohyla Lecturer. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing his talk tonight on Chernobyl and the result that this event has had on the ecosystem and the region's geology. So I won't keep you any longer, and I will pass things back over to Nadia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marsh. And now to our guest. Dr. Adrian Ivakhiv is a professor of environmental thought and culture at the University of Vermont's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. He is a UVM University Scholar, Public Humanities Fellow, coordinator of Ecoculture Lab, and co-editor of the journal Media and Environment. His publications include the books Ecologies of the Moving Image, Cinema, Affect, Nature, published in 2013, and Shadowing the Anthropocene, Eco-Realism for Turbulent Times, published in 2018. He is currently a visiting scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara's Carsey Wolf Center for Media Studies. Born in Toronto, he was active in the Ukrainian Canadian community as a composer and musician with the avant-garde Ukrainian theater, a conductor of the St. Nicholas Choir, co-editor of the bilingual Terminus magazine, and a teacher at the Ukrainian National Foundation Heritage School in Toronto. His scholarly research in Ukraine goes back to his 1989-1990 tenure as a Canada-USSR scholar studying the cultural impacts of the Chernobyl nuclear accident, and includes work on cultural identity in the Ukrainian-Polish borderlands and the growth of neo-pagan and native faith. As you can see, he is a dynamic scholar and one whom we are very grateful to have join us this evening. Without further ado, I warmly welcome all the way from California, Dr. Adrian Ivakhiv.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for that wonderful introduction and for the opportunity to speak on this topic at this time. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see it. Hopefully you're seeing a full screen image that is the title image for this talk. When I was asked to do this talk, I didn't imagine that we'd be on the brink of an invasion and potentially international broadening of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Since I study media and the word is in my subtitle, I was going to show some memes about the media coverage of this crisis, but today they feel a little too lacking in gravity. Here's another set, which is a joke that, as you'll see, comes from a useful recycle bin. It's been used before. For Ukrainians and really for the world, it's a pretty serious development. And one of its inscrutabilities is this persistent question, what is he thinking? While that won't be my focus tonight, it will be in the background, and some of what I discuss will resonate with this question. So back to tonight's lecture topic. I'll start with a quick comment about the fourth letter in the word Chernobyl, which I've written as both a crossed O or a hybrid of an O and an E, and I'll explain that. My general practice is to spell Chernobyl with an E for the reactor and for the 1986 nuclear accident, not only because these have been and remain the English language standard for the 36 years since the accident, but also because they happen to accurately reflect the cultural and linguistic reality that helped shape the accident. The nuclear reactor was a Soviet one, and the Soviet Union, including the Soviet Ukraine, in which the reactor was built, was linguistically a Russian dominant society. That said, the argument to spell Chernobyl with an O is a good one, as with Kiev becoming Kyiv to reflect the national language of independent Ukraine. My own preference is Kyiv with 2 dots over the I, but that doesn't seem to have caught on. I use Chernobyl with an O for the town itself, and the mix of the two when I refer to both. Let me comment briefly on the other keywords in the title: ecology, Anthropocene, and event, now that we've touched on media. I gave a talk back in 2016 on the 30th anniversary of the Chernobyl accident that became the outline of a book, which is still in progress, on the 7 stories in and around Chernobyl. And I've published bits of it in short forms since then, and have been extending the argument into one about how certain significant events, which I call hyper events, change the relationships between time scales and spatial scales. And I'll say more about that as we go. Originally, my talk today was going to focus on 3 layers of those stories, those pertaining to ecology, media, and the Anthropocene. But it turns out that the others are still relevant for understanding today's developments. So I'll actually introduce all 7 of the layers of the onion, so to speak, of Chernobyl, update them, and connect them to the current crisis. Let me comment. Okay, so many of us have come to realize that the global climate crisis, along with the ecological crisis of which it is a part, is the gravest and most serious challenge humanity has had to collectively face in its history. And that resolving the crisis will require a massive shift in individual and collective attitudes, perceptions, behaviors, and values, which means a change on cultural as well as institutional levels. Much of my research is guided by that understanding, and also by a recognition that the change that we need rarely happens from individual initiatives. Rather, it's precipitated by events that reshape the possibilities for perception and action. I call such events hyper events to recognize that their causes are multiple, their impacts are complex, diffuse, nonlinear, and unpredictable. They're events that emerge from a collision or concatenation of processes unfolding on multiple temporal and spatial scales. And in their cascading impacts, they change and scramble the relations between those scales. They scramble coordinates and open up possibilities for change that otherwise wouldn't be there. So that's in the background of my analysis of Chernobyl, the nuclear accident of 1986, and the impact that it has had on the world. And I'll come back to this idea of the hyper event at the end. So one such event, as I'll try to show, was the 1986 nuclear accident in Chernobyl, Ukraine. And these are the 7 stories, layers of the onion, so to speak, that I'll tell in my effort to show how it was that. The story of media interpenetrates with all of them in different ways, and I'll just refer to a few of those ways tonight. So story number 1. In literary terms, this one is a tragedy, the story of a rise and a fall. And I'll do this one pretty quickly. It's a story in which the intellectuals, here it is Vladimir Lenin, united with the peasants and the proletarians to the task of building a new social order, a collectivized order of mechanized agriculture and industry for feeding humanity and enabling human opportunity. Faced by the mightiest of enemies, war, fascism, this actor would unify people and army, science and communism to rebuild everything, and ultimately to conquer space in the name of peace. His triumph in space would become the new anthem for all Soviet peoples. And on April 12, 1961, with Yuri Gagarin's ascent into space, the mythic vision became a reality. Science and technology were intimately linked in this story to the triumph of socialism and of the new man. In the unity of science and production was the power and future of the country. In the USSR, science and technology served as a kind of alternative religion, useful to the regime, but also independent, it was able to harbor a kind of spiritual counterculture for the physicists and the cosmic dreamers. It harbored a vision of the universe with man at its heart, the noosphere, a new layer added to the biosphere. And both those terms were coined by a Ukrainian physicist, Volodymyr Vernadsky. This has been called the Sputnik religion. But as with the West, the space race was always part and parcel of the arms race, the military-industrial complex that aimed to rival the West and to beat the West at its own game. The shadow side remained in the shadows. The Mayak nuclear disaster in Kishtim of 1957 remains the third most serious nuclear disaster ever recorded. An explosion released an estimated 20 megacuries of radioactivity, and fallout from the radioactive cloud resulted in long-term contamination of 500 to 1,500 square miles of territory, primarily with cesium-137 and strontium-90. News about the disaster was contained, and we'll come back to this word containment several times today, under a cloud of secrecy for years. In 1968, Soviet authorities named the East Ural radioactive trace area the East Urals Nature Reserve, effectively prohibiting unauthorized access to the area. But the nuclear program grew. In 1970, the city of Pripyat was founded to serve as the 9th model nuclear city of the Soviet Union. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 exploded. The next day, within 36 hours of the explosion, the 47,000 residents of Pripyat were evacuated. But news was kept quiet until reports appeared in the Western media of a radioactive cloud over Sweden. In the end, the accident shattered the Sputnik vision, and in doing so deprived any obvious backup to the Soviet system, a system that it revealed as corrupt, negligent, and more obsessed with damage control and with Communist Party privileges than with the safety of the general population. Research over the years suggests that the reactor was poorly designed, that its staff on the night of April 26th acted less than competently, but also that the government lied about the disaster in the most criminal way, I'm quoting here. In the crucial first 10 days when the reactor core was burning and releasing a steady stream of highly radioactive material into the surrounding area, the authorities repeatedly claimed that the situation was under control. Fortunately, the disaster contributed substantially to Glasnost, the program of openness touted by Gorbachev as necessary in the Soviet Union's management of its own difficulties. Environmental historian Joachim Radkau writes that Chernobyl finally delegitimized the Soviet system of secrecy and cover-ups. And it, among other things, led to the cancellation of environmentally unsound mega projects, including the plan to re-divert several Siberian rivers to Central Asia, which was a massive mega project. During the 4 years that followed, ecological protest became the first legal embodiment of broadly democratic protest in the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, Zeleny Svit became the first independent organization to register its existence in 1989. And by October, it became a national umbrella organization for various local environmental and anti-nuclear clubs. By the spring of 1990, there were about 300 of these clubs in Zeleny Svit. And at the same time, the national independence movement, or Ruch, was growing as similar movements grew across the former Soviet republics. In August of '91, Ukrainians voted overwhelmingly for independence and the creation of a sovereign Ukrainian state. Now, the causal relationship between the Chernobyl accident and the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union has been debated, but it's generally considered to be one of the key elements. This brings us to story number 2, Ukraine, a country in search of itself. A lot has been said and written about how Ukraine has been seen by others as a borderland or frontier region, as a breadbasket, though it's not clear whose basket, Europe's, the Soviet Union's, or someone else's. A basket, after all, belongs to someone, and today we might suggest perhaps President Putin is considering that. The 20th century saw the duality of the Ukrainian countryside and the Ukrainian industrial city altered by a depopulation of villages, which whose peasants, whose farmers were turned into a working class, largely for agro-industrial machines. Woods and mountains were deforested, river valleys were flooded and turned into electricity, and a class of villagers were turned into urban serfs, service workers, and a mobile reserve labor pool. While the countryside became the site of dispossession, coloniality, and victimization, none of this was more evident than during the Great Hunger of 1932-33, the Holodomor, which has come to rival the formerly central narrative of the Soviet Union of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, which affected Ukraine arguably more than any other territory or nation. But there are rival and multiple historical traumas, an entire history of purifications of what had once been a multi-ethnic and religiously diverse fabric constituting the Ukrainian so-called borderlands, the Kresy, as they are known in Polish, the Jewish Pale of Settlement, and all the other forms of coexistence that, as Kate Brown shows in her book Biography of No Place, were gradually erased by projects of imperial purification of one kind or another, Russian imperial, Soviet imperial, German Nazi imperial. Chernobyl itself is thoroughly marked, and this is the town, is thoroughly marked by this history. The 12th century village that became the town after which the nuclear plant was named reflects this complex history of becomings, erasures, and disappearances. Imperial narratives continue to circulate around Ukraine today, and this is a quote that you could have heard last year from the same person on the right there, although he made it to President George Bush in 2008 as well. Ukraine well fits the model of the post-colony, a place that's peripheral by definition, once subjugated, now freed, always subjugated, never fully freed. And there's a whole argument behind this, which I won't get into. In its becoming an independent nation at the beginnings of the late 1980s independence movement, contemporary Ukraine worked against these tendencies by carving itself out as a regime of national memory, a project of constituting a land and a people united and defined by trauma. There were so many commemorations, funeral marches, and memorials in the year I spent there in 1989 and 90 that I could have spent half my life attending these, half my time there. Independent Ukraine has, in this sense, been the story of a Ukraine that it is in a state of perpetual becoming and never quite getting there. Becoming European, a process we've seen take hold quite vigorously during the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Maidan Revolution of 2014, a process whose conclusion has yet to be reached, but always shadowed by the option of becoming or remaining Eurasian, Greater Russian, post-Soviet, Slavic Orthodox, or something else. The option of becoming Ukrainian comes in different flavors. One is a new old Ukrainianism that returns to a romanticized past of heroes and nation builders. Another is less a return to the past than a carving out of a space where power can maintain itself between the various forms of becoming, the Western and the Eastern, so as to keep itself in control. And I won't get into politics except to mention that it's ever present. In the post-Maidan revolution period, the dominant becoming for a while became a regime of commemoration, in this case, commemorating the heroes of the revolution, the so-called Heavenly Hundred, who perished in February of 2014 on the streets of Kyiv. Though eventually Ukrainians tired of it and just wanted to live normally, following Western norms of political theater, as it seems. There are two paradoxical ways in which the Chernobyl accident enters this narrative of Ukraine in search of itself. The accident became a fulcrum around which Ukrainian independence and sovereignty were articulated, a sovereignty involving taking responsibility for the colossal tragedy that the previous landowner, the Soviet Union, failed to manage. Secondly, and ironically, once Ukraine proclaimed independence, the issue of nuclear power and of environment in general moved far from the center of Ukrainian interests, taking a backseat to economic and cultural issues. We'll pick up this strand a little bit in story number 4. The legacy of Ukraine as a state of perpetual becoming and never quite getting there is very much alive with us today as the country collectively moves away from Russia with some ambivalence, but much less than 10 years ago, and yet at the same time is not allowed to move away from Russia. Story number 3 is an espionage tale, spy versus spy, and really a tale of modernity as premised on military technologies that require secrecy, non-transparency, information control, and that in turn breeds suspicion, rumor, gossip, and conspiracy. There's a word that's still with us today. This is a map of the world's political relations circa 1980. Note the red and the blue. Here's another one looking from the North Pole. Here it's dark red and light red and pink. This is the fear that my generation grew up with when I came to political maturity as a university student in the 1980s, the fear that we may not live until the year 2000. We're in 2022, we've made it. On one side, then, were the fat cats of capital who drained and plundered the rest of the world of its resources for their private gain. On the other were the totalitarians who would take away the liberties and the minds of anyone in order to impose control over the world. The totalitarians had their massive system of prisons for those who disagreed with them, a prison industrial complex that was also economic in nature. We thought that was all over and done with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of our story number 1. But the other side hasn't necessarily given up its own global networks of power, black sites, secret detention centers, and other loci of control. And like a ghost that never goes away, Ukraine has found itself caught in the fault lines of the same old dichotomy, the Cold War order poking its head into the gaps papered over by 25 or 30 or now, what is it, 32 years of a new global world, such that any move either by the NATO states or by Russia is a move that brings back the entirety of the system of information and disinformation, a false flag operation, a provocatia. The Maidan Revolution and its aftermath offered all kinds of material ripe for conspiratorializing on both sides, such that for a couple of years, Ukraine had actually become central to the regime of global information that's premised on disinformation, a global media system, newly global media system, premised on a highly unstable, multipolar world with Russia under Putin positioning itself as one of the truly skillful players with an information regime whose mechanics and general sense of direction are highly volatile potentially. And just a quick reminder about how disinformation has not only not gone away since the end of the Cold War, but has seemingly infiltrated everywhere. In the last 8 years, we've grown used to information warfare being very much a part of a hybrid approach to conflict, with a case in point being the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, if you remember that. I won't get into that. Just in the last few days, we're being subjected to disinformation about so-called genocide against presumably Russians, by which I think that Russia Today, Sputnik and other RIA Novosti and Putin mean Ukrainian citizens who've been given Russian citizenship in order that they can now be considered Russians and not Ukrainians. The top right image is actually from this morning, but the claims have been around for several years. The two on the left are from December. The bottom one is from 2017. So it's not a new information campaign, but the fact that Putin mentioned it in his conversation with Olaf Scholz was a bit unsettling. This was yesterday or the day before. To bring things back to Chernobyl, of course, there were many conspiracy theories around it, a kind of conspiratorial culture. This was just one, the Duga 3 International Radar System, which I visited, which is possible to visit, operated from 1982 in what's now the Exclusion Zone on the outskirts of the town of Chernobyl. And there's a big story, there's a lot of stories around it. It's named after the knocking sound it made on shortwave radio receivers around the world. And the theory goes that a high-ranking Communist Party apparatchik by the name of Shamshin ordered the power down test at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, knowing it will result in an accident because he wanted to eradicate any interest in the failure of this Duga 3 radar system. It's now, the system is under control of the Ukrainian military, though that doesn't seem to prevent visitors from visiting it. Story number 4 is the story of a technology that comes to us double-edged, a knife with 2 ends, a Frankenstein's monster that may just need a little more love, a Pandora's box whose contents may or may not change the fabric of the world into which it's released. From its beginnings, nuclear power has been the promise of military power softened, tamed, and marketed by the promise of the peaceful atom that could be used to power industrial society for the good of all. Today, it's to power industrial society through the crisis of climate change into a good Anthropocene. And this is an active discussion among some environmentalists even, which I won't really get into, but I did want to mention it. In the narrative, in the history of nuclear power, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the hundreds of subsurface or surface nuclear bomb tests carried out over the decades constitute the undeniable evidence that the promise of plenty is always tainted by the risk of destruction. With Chernobyl, we enter a global risk culture, as Ulrich Beck, German sociologist, has called it, characterized by uncertainty, instability, and disparity in social groups' capacities to avoid or absorb risk. Events like the Chernobyl accident are harbingers of a broader ecological collapse that remains ever virtual, always on the horizon, yet which comes to us in data points on an almost daily basis. This disaster here, this oil spill there, this wildfire here, and I'll come back to that in my concluding comments. Data points that connect in the impacts of industrial activity, the production of pollutants, toxins, and hazardous wastes affecting terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, climate systems, social systems, and so on. The anti-nuclear movement, which has always shadowed the pro-nuclear movement, took great force from the Chernobyl accident. The West German Greens actually achieved their highest proportion of the national vote in 1987, 8.3%, which wasn't matched until 2002. They've done better since then. In the wake of Fukushima, the issue of nuclear power has become more acute, especially as some environmentalists have begun to see it as potentially part of the climate crisis solution. Moving on, for the sake of time, story number 5 is a little unfinished as well and ongoing. It's a story of how the science and technology that provided control over nuclear reactions is also a science for managing people and living substance, a regime of management that has had to be installed in the governance of populations, both human and non-human. These pictures are photograms taken from they're essentially camera-less photographs in which an object is placed directly onto the surface of light-sensitive materials, photographic paper, and then exposed to light. And they are from this book called Chernobyl Herbarium, a beautifully written book by philosopher Michael Marder and photographer Anais Tonder. Marder's commentary here connects the practice of photogramming radiated plants with the Buddhist practice of breathing in suffering and transmuting it into compassion. Among the populations that required compassion were those redefined by the Chernobyl accident as sufferers, a category of some 3.5 million Ukrainians. So this is a specifically Ukrainian history. Belarus also had its response to the accident, which I won't go into, and Russia as well. As mentioned, independent Ukraine considered Chernobyl its badge of honor, a way to establish its international legitimacy. So it set up a regime of identification and of qualifications for social and medical benefits. It expanded the status of sufferer, a term that was already there in late Soviet times, by lowering the threshold of allowable radiation dose intakes over a lifetime from 35 to 7 rems, by creating 4 categories of sufferers depending on their involvement in various cleanup activities, evacuation and relocation activities, etc., and by creating a bureaucratic apparatus, including a 12% Chernobyl tax for welfare provisions to this category of citizen. Adriana Petrina's book, Life Exposed, is a masterful anthropological account of this population as a social, medical, biological, and psychological construct. Among the sufferers were the liquidators, the 600,000 or so soldiers and civilians sent in to quell the fires, clean up debris, construct the sarcophagus, decontaminate and bury buildings and villages, and so on. Unfortunately, the healthcare system in Ukraine has not been able to provide the kind of care that the state presumably wanted to provide these sufferers and liquidators, as its economy has suffered from years of, among other things, neoliberal reforms, but also graft, corruption, and financial calculation as part of the governance of these populations. This is a mural here depicting doctors fighting cancer. And here's where the management of populations by governments has become connected over the last few decades to the management of populations by algorithms, including healthcare systems and insurance systems. And this is a much larger topic than I can address today, with Ukraine's role in it being ultimately a side note, with Chernobyl providing a kind of way in, but I'll leave this topic. Story number 6, where things get more interesting still. This is the imagined Chernobyl, the zone that in fact begins more and more to resemble and to reshape the real zone of alienation, or zona відчуження, zone of estrangement. When the accident occurred, the most ready-to-hand template for interpreting it was Andrei Tarkovsky's 1979 film Stalker, based on a science fiction novel, Roadside Picnic, about an anomalous zone created by, in the novel, extraterrestrial debris, but in the film, this is left ambiguous. This zone is cordoned off behind an army-patrolled border with travel into it prohibited. The film's theme resonated at the time with Soviet audiences on multiple levels, which I won't go into, the Gulag and the Waldorf West and much else. But after the Chernobyl accident, it resonated on this additional level. The evacuated 30-kilometer exclusion zone came to be called the zone, zona, and unofficial tour guides to the evacuated area referred to themselves as stalkers. The making of the film has a whole bunch of other stories with political and environmental overtones, including the apparent chemical poisoning of the film crew, the fact that many of them died from cancer. It was filmed in Estonia, in and around an abandoned Estonian power plant, downstream from a chemical plant. So this kind of ties together with story number 4 or 5, I've forgotten now. They're all starting to mix together a little bit. But I'll pass on this, which I write about in my book, Ecologies of the Moving Image. As an apparently uninhabitable zone, the exclusion zone has attracted many kinds of stalkers, with estimates ranging in the thousands, though the very serious ones perhaps in the hundreds. The zone invites curiosity and even a kind of utopian aspiration. It's become a zone of dark, extreme, or doom tourism. And also a kind of more generic curiosity tourism. You can visit the zone legally these days. Between 10 and 20,000 tourists a year, I believe, have been visiting it up until the COVID pandemic. Then there are the gamers, some of whom take their video games seriously enough to play them out in real life. As Sarah Phillips puts it, an increasing number of Chernobyl tourists are avid gamers and enthusiasts of the Stalker video game series, in which players battle zombies, mutant animals, and other improbable foes in a sensationalized, contaminated zone of alienation. And this accounts for a lot of people wanting to visit the zone. These are very extremely popular games. With millions of copies distributed worldwide. Call of Chernobyl is one of them. A few pictures of stalker gamers visiting the zone that they themselves upload onto the web. More prosaic, perhaps, are the samosiele, the self-settlers, several hundred of whom have returned to the area unofficially, beneath the radar, as it were, many of whom grow their own food in the often contaminated soil. Many are elderly residents who couldn't find their place outside the zone. At one point, there were over 1,000 of these within the Chernobyl zone. More recent counts put them closer to the 300, 400 range. Finally, there's the ecological bounce back in the zone of exclusion ever since most of the humans abandoned it. As Mary Mitchell writes in Wormwood Forest, the Chernobyl zone has become a vast and beautiful wilderness of forests and wetlands that are gradually consuming the remains of towns and villages. They're teeming with moose, deer, wild boars, some 250 species of birds, wolves seen in broad daylight, wild Przewalski horses reintroduced and thriving, and even endangered lynx making a comeback. The zone is therefore a zone of presence and of absence, the presence of forces unleashed by industrial calamity, the absence of the causes of those forces, the human and industrial activities that precipitated them, except as ruins, memories, and odd remainders. So there's a kind of dialectic or unanswerability between, on the one hand, the ecological negatives of radiation and the ecological positives of rewilding, as ecologists call it. That's in some ways becoming the dominant discourse around the Chernobyl zone today. This is an article that just came out last week in Knowable magazine. All right, this brings us to our final story, the story to end all stories, perhaps, the story that turns the other stories inside out. The Anthropocene narrative should by now be somewhat familiar. It's that humanity has become such a powerful force on this planet that its impacts have now been registered geologically, to the degree that future geologists looking back on our time will note that this layer is distinctly different from the previous one, the era called the Holocene. The four main variations of this Anthropocene narrative dated back either to the beginnings of widespread agriculture, deforestation, rice cultivation, and stock raising, the demographic collapse across the Americas resulting from the arrival of Eurasian biocultural invaders, as it were, humans, animals, plants, germs, and diseases, which resulted in rapid reforestation after the collapse of indigenous biocultural systems, people and animals and others, which dramatically subsumed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it's a recognizable blip in the carbon record. So it's been proposed that this may be taken as the beginning of the so-called Anthropocene. But more commonly, the Anthropocene is dated to the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, and so on, a couple of hundred years ago, or to here's another version of that, the Anthropocene beginning in 1775, or to this thing called the Great Acceleration, which historians date to the mid-20th century with its atom bombs, petrochemicals, fertilizers, plastics, and all the layers of novel substances that have accompanied them and that have led to these rapid increases in various forms of toxicity and so on. Chernobyl fits into the fourth Anthropocene variation particularly well. Its release of radioactive isotopes was the single largest such release. Its half-lives reach all the way down to the age of the Earth. In the case of uranium-238, a half-life is a probabilistic determination of the time it takes for half of a radioactive sample to decay into non-radioactive material. So this is deep time that we're talking about. Coming back to the zone of exclusion, we see something very counter to the trends of the Anthropocene, and at the same time, very much a form of evidence for it, this return of nature. The real zone was named by Ukrainian President Poroshenko a radiation ecological biosphere reserve, which followed several years of planning to name it a special biosphere reserve. Chernobyl is in this sense a zone of sacrifice that connects it to a larger global geography of sacrifice, whereby industrial civilization, the same one celebrated by the Soviet story, story number one, of conquering nature, which had its Western versions, of course, whereby that story creates its shadow places, so to speak, its national sacrifice areas, its no-go zones, its devastated landscapes, and its deathscapes. The zone, in this sense, perhaps is not the 30-kilometer exclusion zone around a place like Chernobyl, but rather the other way around. The zone is us, humans transforming the surface of the Earth on a scale that's geological. The zone is the Holocene, which in fact provided the conditions for everything we know as civilization, and which we today know are at extremely high risk of being destabilized. The Chernobyl accident is, in this sense, an event marking endings, but also beginnings, and an end that made certain endings and certain beginnings possible. It's a hyper event with multiple causes, with impacts on a range of time scales, as I've tried to show, some of which made it possible for instance, the USSR to collapse. So that story is, in a certain sense, finished. For Ukraine to regain a new life in this kind of story of struggling toward something, nationhood or membership in the world community, recognition, and so on. In this story of what back then we called the Cold War, which today continues through the evolution of contemporary media systems, which has now become part of a globalized, multipolar world within which media play a very important role in both instilling conflict and hopefully ultimately resolving it, but we really haven't mastered that. We haven't figured it out globally. So that's a key piece that's very much in motion, in which nuclear power remains very much still with us, with nuclear waste sitting around, not really safely buried for the tens of thousands of years that it should be buried somewhere. So very much a question mark, within which the ways in which human and non-human populations are governed have been changing. And I mentioned algorithmic governance, and that's a huge other topic, within which our own imagining of these kinds of spaces, these spaces, zones of estrangement, should become part of the way we imagine ourselves on the earth and our relationship to nature, and within which all of that bears witness to a time that some are calling the Anthropocene, but which I would suggest requires more thought. And I will leave it at that, except to say that the lesson of story number 7 is that we stand at that forbidden zone still today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for such a thought-provoking and holistic presentation. We now welcome any questions that you may have for Dr. Ivakhiv. Again, we ask that you please just type them into the chat window at the bottom of your screen, and I will happily ask them on your behalf. As maybe individual, oh, we have a question. Thank you. From Oksana Dudko. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on media representations of the Chernobyl meltdown in the West. To what extent does the Chernobyl catastrophe define the image of Ukraine in the West?
Yeah, thank you, Oksana, for that question. You probably noticed that I started with the image of Chernobyl not from reality, so to speak, but from maybe what we can call reality TV, the HBO program, 5-part, I think it was, series from, what is it, about a couple of years ago now. And I didn't really get into that. I have another talk where I do get into that a little bit more, but I do think that the Chernobyl catastrophe is one of the ways in which Ukraine certainly made it into the news. But in the 1980s, it was still very much considered, I think, a Soviet catastrophe, a Soviet nuclear reactor. I'm not sure to what extent Western media representations have taken on board the idea that Chernobyl is a defining moment, that the nuclear accident is a defining moment for the independent Ukrainian state that begins its life or re-begins its life in 1991. But I do think that there are so many media representations still out there, and the HBO series, among others, has kind of recirculated some of these images. That said, the kind of imagery that's associated with Chernobyl specifically often, in my view, takes a form that some scholars call post-human, in the sense that we see these cities, Pripyat, for instance, as depopulated, buildings with no people, taken over by grass and wolves and whatever other animals and so on. So I'm not sure to what extent Chernobyl defines the image of Ukraine. I think by now Ukraine has been in the news so much in recent years, and especially in the last 8-9 years, that I think the image of Ukraine in Western media is much more complex. But I'm curious to hear your or anyone else's thought on that.
We have another question. The possibility of war occurring in a country with nuclear reactors for the first time may become a reality. Do you think this might figure into Western intervention?
Well, one of the points that I try to make when I talk to people, particularly those who aren't convinced that that the West should be supporting Ukraine, is that Ukraine gave up its nuclear reactors in 1990, 93, 94. They gave up its entire nuclear, not its reactors, but its nuclear weapons, its entire arsenal, in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the UK, the US. I can't remember if there was someone else who was party to that, that they would not be attacked, that their territory, if it ever was attacked, as it now has been, others would come to their defense. So that's in my mind, the primary argument for not allowing Russian incursions on Ukrainian territory, because it in fact gave up what at the time was the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. Now, nuclear reactors being in Ukraine, I'm not sure to what extent that figures into Western intervention. I haven't seen much discussion of that. Again, I'm happy to hear others' views on this.
Another question. You mentioned that Chernobyl is an agent for change. Could it not be a metaphor for paralysis? It prompted the rise of the Green Movement as a civic response, but this has petered out as broader geopolitical issues have taken hold. The crisis looms, but traditions remain.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to characterize Chernobyl as an agent for change so much as I would characterize the event what I'm calling the Chernobyl event as something that made possible certain deep shifts that wouldn't have been possible up to that point. So change, but not necessarily positive change, just deep structural changes. It brought together things that were happening on different timescales, in a sense. So ultimately, it served as an agent for change in the sense that it helped to make possible popular protest, which ultimately became the independence movements, which brought down the Soviet Union in part. In part, it was economics. In part, it was other sorts of things. So it's more complex than just being an agent for change. But sure, Chernobyl is also a kind of metaphor for paralysis. I think the way I speak of the zone of estrangement, the Chernobyl zone, I try to think of it as a metaphor for both paralysis and some kind of hopefully insight into how humans are intertwined with the larger natural world in ways that we're only starting to understand today. So that doesn't really answer your questions. I mean, certainly traditions remain, as you put it, and they're very much in play. And the fall of the Soviet Union unleashed a certain resurgence of what we might think of as traditions, of traditional ways of thinking about identity and so on in Eastern Europe.
Another question from Bohdan Kordan. Olaf Scholz said that Germany would be free of its dependence on Russian fossil fuels. He indicated that German assistance to Ukraine will focus on developing hydrogen fields and as alternative energy source. Is this likely? What are the geopolitical implications of this?
Thanks, Bohdan. Great question. I wish I knew whether it's likely or not. I certainly hope that that if he's said that he's willing to back it up with action if it comes to that. I know his Green party, is she the foreign minister, I believe, I forget her name, is likely pushing him in that direction, whereas the sort of traditions of the Social Democrats, SPD party that he represents are more likely pushing him away from taking that kind of radical action if there was a Russian invasion. It's true that Germany is to some extent dependent on Russia, and there's a complicated relationship with Germany's anti-nuclear stance over the years. They're relying more on natural gas and so on. So what are the geopolitical implications? I think they're huge. I think the whole discussion in Europe with Germany's role in NATO and in the EU and its reluctance compared to some of the other countries to take as hard a line with Russia is significant. But I think there's a broad spectrum of possibilities, and we'll see what happens, I guess.
Saeed Moshiri asks, first he says, hi, thanks for your great presentation. Could you comment on the current state of the nuclear plants in Russia and Ukraine? Is Russia expanding the nuclear plants domestically and abroad, and how safe are they?
That's an excellent question, and I regret to say that I'm not up to date on what they're doing with their nuclear plants right now. In Ukraine, it took many years for Chernobyl to be completely shut down, but now it is. But as I understand it, some of the other nuclear plants are operational. I tend to think of Russia as a fossil fuel power, as a kind of gas and oil petro state in some sense. So I don't really think of its nuclear plants when I think of the geopolitics surrounding Russia today. I'd love to hear someone's answer to that who is aware of the state of nuclear power in Russia today. Sorry for not having a good answer to that.
Any other questions for Dr. Ivakhiv? If there are no more questions, or if perhaps you'd like to think a bit more before asking a question, I'm sure you could email us at PCUH and we would be happy to pass on any questions to Dr. Ivakhiv after the fact. If there are no more questions, I will just have a few closing statements and then we will conclude our presentation today. Even in a virtual format, a lecture such as this takes efforts to organize. My thanks to Natalia Shevchuk and Oksana Dudko for their assistance and support ahead of tonight's lecture. Most importantly, thank you to our inspiring guest, Dr. Adrian Ivakhiv, for engaging us in this topic, shedding light on some of the lasting complexities that exist for Ukraine, particularly during this tense time. We only wish that we could host you properly, though appreciate that you would likely prefer the Californian sun as opposed to the Saskatchewan snow. Thank you very much for sharing your time and knowledge with us, and we sincerely wish you the best as you continue your tenure as a visiting scholar. One quick announcement before we conclude this evening's event. The PCUH will be hosting an upcoming roundtable discussion entitled The Ukrainian Question, Searching for a New Vocabulary to Define the Current International Crisis. And it is organized by our Petro Yatsik postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Oksana Dudko. This roundtable will take place on Tuesday, March 22nd at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time, once again over Zoom. It will feature our former director, Bogdan Kurdan, Oresia Kulik of the University of Manitoba, Oksana Chevel of Tufts University, Serhiy Yakelchik of the University of Victoria, and it will be moderated by Marta Dichok of Western University. Please keep an eye on our website and Facebook page for the link to be posted soon. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for your attendance and for your questions this evening. We encourage you to stay in touch with us and our events, either through our website, pcuh.stmcollege.ca, or through our Facebook page. Wishing you all good health and a pleasant evening. Buvайте здорові. Добраніч. Good night.